Hey everybody, today we are debating whether or not morality is evidence for God, and we are starting right now.
All
Hey
right.
everybody, stoked to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us for this epic debate on whether or not morality is evidence for God. And with that, just want to let you know we at the very start of the title put PD, and there are a couple of things that's hopefully going to remind me about. One is, first, if you are new here, feel free to hit that subscribe button, as we have a lot more debates coming up we're very excited about, and we're trying to build a nonpartisan platform. We want to be as neutral and fair as possible to all parties, and we're also trying to build a very eclectic community, a ideologically diverse community of different people. So if you're Christian, atheist, or one of the many strange creatures in between, we're glad you are here. And in addition, PD at the start of our title is just a reminder for me. I'll take that reminder out later so it doesn't look so silly, but for a podcast person I could hire. If there's somebody out there, I don't quite have the time, but I've had several people say, hey, we'd love to have this on podcast. And I'm like, I would love to do it. If it's something that people could use, awesome. And so I'm looking for anybody who's really good with, basically, if you can strip our audio from these debates and put it onto different podcast platforms, I will pay you. So that's something that we're hoping to offer very soon. And so yeah, just give me an email if you can, if you know how to do that, at moderndaydebate@gmail.com. So, great. I always forget that, but finally got it. So thank you for those of you who have asked, and I swear all the time, the best ideas always come from people just emailing or in the live chat everywhere else. So thanks so much for everybody's help. And want to mention, we are stoked about this. Dr. Robert M. Price is going to be debating here with Jonathan Sheffield on whether or not a historical intellectual case could be made for the Christian faith. It's going to be a blast. We are thrilled to have the atheist theologian Dr. Robert M. Price, who's debated people like Bart Ehrman, William Lane Craig, James White. So he is going to be here, and it's going to be epic. So hopefully you can make it for that, as we are thrilled for that on April 12th. So with that, let's jump right into it. Very excited to introduce these gentlemen. I want to mention these two gentlemen, very cordial. They've been really patient, as unfortunately this debate was a little bit delayed at several weeks, and so I appreciate them being here and for their just being so easy to work with. The second thing is, their links are down in the description. So if you listen to them today and you're like, man, that knocked my socks off, no problem. You can check out their material down below. And even if you're like, that Candor man is back, well, you know what? He's going to grow on you. If you check out his link, you'll be like, oh, you know what? I kind of like him the more I get to know him. So you can check out both of these gentlemen. With that, we're going to jump right into it. So, given that we usually have the affirmative go first, Maverick Christian, we're thrilled to have you here. In fact, Candor man, you as well. Thank you guys for coming on. And we will start with Maverick Christian, who will be giving just a quick opening, and then we'll go into the open dialogue. So we're going to jump to full screen mode. And thank you again for being here, gentlemen.
All right. Okay, see my screen? Right?
It's almost there. There we go.
All right. So I'll just, oh, no, not that one. All right, so is morality evidence for God? So the approach I'm going to take is deductive for morality being evidence for God. Premise one, if God does not exist, then nothing is morally wrong. Premise two, some things are morally wrong, like torturing infants just for fun, and therefore God exists. So moral semantics is how we define moral terminology. And for this argument, it's important to understand the moral semantics it's using for moral obligations. So moral obligations have an ought component. Like an action is morally wrong for someone only if they ought not to do it. So what type of ought are we using here? Sometimes words like ought and should are purely descriptive. So that's what a descriptive ought is. It's that type of ought that is reducible to something that's purely descriptive. So an example is when if you want to do well in school, you ought to study just means something like, as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. So in contrast, we can say that a prescriptive ought is that sort of ought that is not a descriptive ought. It prescribes in a way that is not purely descriptive. So someone saying you should not torture infants just for fun might be using that sort of ought. So the standard moral semantics is that moral oughts are prescriptive. That is, it is false that the moral ought has no properties besides purely descriptive ones. So for example, an action is morally obligatory for someone only if they prescriptively ought to do it. So as a warning, and this is where I think sometimes theists and atheists can talk past each other, some non-theists have moral semantics where moral obligations are entirely descriptive. May seem a bit strange, but it does happen sometimes. An important point for this, for my case here, is that morality is non-natural. So moral property is prescriptive oughtness, like moral wrongness, are non-natural, and that they're not part of the natural physical world. So this can be demonstrated fairly rigorously with mathematics and symbolic logic, but we don't have time to go into that. But if you are interested in that, I have an article on my blog which links to the scholarly paper and explains the math and symbolic logic that's used. For our purposes, though, we'll just go through an illustration about why moral properties are empirically undetectable. So imagine a moral nihilist who does not believe in morality and a moral realist who does believe in morality. Both observe some jerk kicking a dog just for fun. The dog whimpers in pain and runs away. Both agree on all the same physiological and psychological facts, like the dog felt pain and suffered minor injury. Now, the moral nihilist says, I don't think moral oughtness, like moral wrongness, is attached to that action. The moral realist says, I think moral wrongness is attached to that action. Here's the thing. There is no empirical way to determine who is right. Both views agree on all the same empirically observable facts. And that's because that prescriptive oughtness is non-physical. It's causally inert. It's not part of the natural physical world. And that hopefully that scenario illustrates that being the case. But if moral properties like moral wrongness are empirically undetectable, how do we know about it? So, in practice, we have to rely on intuition to believe that morality exists. And then the question then becomes like, okay, well, how does moral intuition properly justify our belief in morality? On theism, the theist could believe that God designed our cognitive faculties in such a way that when they're functioning properly, they intuitively apprehend morality's existence. So our awareness of morality become a kind of God-given intuitive knowledge. But on atheism, well, remember that moral wrongness is non-natural and causally inert. So barring the supernatural, our brains would give us the same intuitions of morality existence regardless of whether morality existed. And that would seem to undercut such moral intuition from properly justifying our belief in morality. So on atheism, it seems like we wouldn't have any good reason to believe that morality exists. And this will become important later on. And so here's my general approach in justifying that first premise. If God does not exist, then nothing is morally wrong. So there's a theorem in mathematics and propositional logic we'll get to when I say that I'll argue that on morality's existence is unlikely if God does not exist. The theorem is that given A, probably C entails probably if A, then C. Here's what it looks like in math and symbolic logic for those who are interested. And so applied here, I'm going to argue that morality is unlikely on atheism, which entails probably if atheism is true, then morality does not exist. If you're interested in the proof of that theorem, that's also available on my blog here. So morality fits in really well with theism. On a theistic worldview, it makes perfect sense for there to be some component of reality transcending our opinion that says people shouldn't do certain things. So just think of God himself. God is non-natural and supremely authoritative, is essentially morality incarnate, at least on one view of what God is. Given theism, we have a plausible mechanism for moral intuition properly justifying moral belief, where moral intuition is basically sort of God-given intuitive knowledge. But now let's contrast that with atheism. Suppose atheism is true. On atheism, recall, we wouldn't have any good reason to believe that morality exists. That's because, barring the supernatural, because moral oughtness is causally inert, the presence or absence would not affect which intuitions our brains would give us. And so, barring the supernatural, we'd have the same intuitions of morality existence regardless of whether morality existed on atheism. And when you think about it, on atheism, moral wrongness is very strange. Moral wrongness is invisible, non-physical, and empirically undetectable. So why shouldn't a consistent atheist reject the existence of this invisible, non-physical thing that cannot be empirically detected if the atheists reject the existence of invisible, non-physical deities that have allegedly not been empirically detected? Given atheism, it seems more likely that people's belief in moral wrongness is a delusion brought about by evolution to get us to behave in certain ways and help our species survive. So given atheism, moral wrongness probably doesn't exist. And as you may recall, that was the rationale behind justifying the first premise. Now, notably, an atheist can't deny both premises of this moral argument on pain of irrationality. So to illustrate why, suppose an atheist denies the second premise. Well, then that atheist believes that, given atheism, given that God does not exist, moral wrongness probably doesn't exist, which would mean the atheist would have to agree that the first premise is true. They're logically committed to accepting the first premise if the atheist rejects the existence of moral wrongness. In my experience, most atheists, when I present this argument to them, like at least online, they deny the second premise. That's the premise they usually deny, which leads us to conflicting worldviews that I suspect this discussion will help illustrate. So many people intuitively sense the non-natural realm. Now, not necessarily with God directly, there's also morality, which is non-natural, at least on the moral semantics that I've described. Just as we intuitively sense the external world being real, many of us intuitively sense that there's something morally wrong with torturing infants just for fun. Even if we can't explain how this moral wrongness property exists, most of us intuitively sense that, yeah, that's wrong. Even if we can't explain how it exists exactly. However, some people apparently don't have a sense of this. They don't sense there's anything wrong with it. Now, I say apparently because I don't know whether they have the sense that there's something wrong with torturing infants. They just ignore it because it doesn't fit their narrative of reality, or they just don't have that sense of morality at all. Now, here's an important disclaimer. Moral nihilists, people who don't believe that anything's morally wrong, they can be nice people, and they can be as opposed to such torture as much as the next person, be in favor of laws against it, and so forth. But if they were to be consistent, they would have to admit that their intense dislike of such torture is just a matter of taste, and there's nothing really wrong with it. Because the moment they do believe people shouldn't torture infants, they're believing in morality. So the problem is not that moral nihilists are bad people. They can be very nice people, just as nice as anybody else. My issue with moral nihilism is that it's not a plausible belief. I don't think it's reasonable to believe that there's nothing morally wrong with torturing infants just for fun. And so here's what I think is a partial explanation of why some people are theists and why some people are atheists. And that is this right here. It might boil down to just people having different intuitive perceptions. And this discussion here might illustrate that. And that's all I have.
Thanks, James. So I'm going to read off the same intro I read off last time. Hopefully not everybody in the chat has already heard it. I believe Maverick has heard it in the past. He seems to have been lurking about my video history. So I've found that the whole moral argument for the existence of God is an appeal to consequences fallacy. A theist who uses such an argument is not satisfied with the idea that morality can be described as an agreement between people on which actions we should take and which we should avoid regarding some specific goal. The most common questions I see theists ask who accept the validity of the moral argument for the existence of God are, how do you know X action is truly wrong? Or, if morals are just subjective agreements between people, then how do you tell Hitler or some other other evil figure that they were wrong? The problem with the first question is that without any context, our accepted goal, wrong, doesn't contain with it any meaning. It is completely devoid of information and can be rejected in the same way that you'd reject a question like, why does car? The second question is equally nonsensical for the same reason, but in a world without God, and in one where societies subjectively accept morals, we would expect to see three things. We would see society stopping what they call evil because it's a threat to them. We would see society stopping what they call evil because of how seeing that evil makes them feel. And lastly, we would see societies not trying to stop that evil at all. This, you'll notice, is the world in which we live. So not only would a theist who uses the moral argument for the existence of God need to describe how it makes sense to call an action wrong without first agreeing on a goal, but they would also need to demonstrate a way in which subjectively accepted goals doesn't fully explain the phenomenon we see in the world, or how some kind of objective morality would explain it better. Now I'm going to jump into Maverick, kind of response to some of Maverick's claims. He said that some atheists he met or have seen debating or in discussion would say that would redefine morality in a way that isn't prescriptive and is descriptive. He's actually correct that this is the way I use morality, or the concept of morality, at least colloquially. Now, I do accept that in philosophy, morality isn't, or in most cases, morality isn't only talking about descriptive systems. It is talking about prescriptive systems, the ought, what we should do. My contention with that is, as I just said in my intro, that's a meaningless statement. For something to just be wrong is just like asking, that is just car. Like it's nonsense. At best, it's a tautology. And if you appeal to a god to ground that oughtness, then you could appeal to anything that objectively exists in the world, assuming that God objectively exists in the world. So this isn't a debate of whether or not God exists. This is a debate of whether or not morality supports the conclusion that God exists. So even if I accept that God exists, I can still say that you either have to reject oughtness as a concept, or you have to say that it is inherently referring back to some objective fact. In a theist position, it would be God, or God's nature, or God's will. In my position, it would be human freedom, the fact of maximal human freedom being potentially achievable. He said, given atheism, so a conclusion would be, given atheism, moral wrongness doesn't exist. My contention is that given anything, moral wrongness doesn't exist. It's just an incoherent concept. He also said, we intuitively know that certain things are wrong. So one of my questions to ask him is, and maybe we can tackle this a bit later because it's not the first thing I want to hit, if he's okay with this. My first question is, why is it that those things we consider in the scope of morality almost always have to do with human well-being? If I take my wallet and I drop it, was that moral, immoral, or amoral? Is it even in the scope of morality? I would say no, not at all. There's no moral intuition that's being applied to that because it doesn't have anything to do with human well-being or human freedom or something about the positively benefiting a human or many humans. So if he's okay with this, I'd like to start with a question that I think is more significant. In a world where societies are created by people with similar goals, one potential goal being to create a society where everyone has the maximal amount of well-being, they all subjectively choose this goal. There's no one enforcing this. They all just have this desire to have well-being, so they come together. Other people have different goals, different desires. Other societies come to different conclusions for whatever reason, and they compete with one another. How would a world where there is no objective ought look any different than the current world we're in? Was that clear? Or
Let's see. How would it look? Well, that's a very complicated question because I believe in God, and so there are some people. So if I were an atheist, I would believe that we would have the same intuitions of morality existence regardless of whether morality existed. Now, I'm not an atheist; I'm a theist, so I don't adhere to that worldview. I believe, well, this is not part of my argument. I believe that morality is grounded in God, such that if morality did not exist, then God, as a foundation of morality, wouldn't exist either, in which case he wouldn't have created the universe, in which case none of us would be around to have any societies whatsoever. So how would it look different? Well, there wouldn't be a society. Like that's what follows in my worldview. From what I get from your opening statement is that you don't believe that moral wrongness as I've defined it exists, that the prescriptive ought exists. Is that correct?
I wouldn't go so far to say it doesn't exist. I think that's a misuse of terms. I think it's just not coherent to use those words in the way that you just did.
Coherent. So, I mean, because I can understand what it means. Yeah, are you unable to understand what it means?
Yeah. So like when you say you should do something, I have to know with regard to what? Like if I hold my wallet, I say, should I drop this? You would have to say, what do you mean? What do you want to do? And if I just say, no, not with regard to anything, without any context, should I drop this?
Okay.
In my view, there's no answer. It's just an incoherent question.
Okay. It sounds like you might be referring to what philosophers call a hypothetical ought. So, a hypothetical imperative goes something like, if you want X, you ought to do Y, and describes a possible action that is practically necessary to achieve some goal. For example, like if you want to do well in school, you ought to study, just means something like, as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. That's a hypothetical imperative, and the ought of a hypothetical imperative is called hypothetical ought. So most of us are familiar with hypothetical oughts, and they're part of everyday language. So you don't believe there's any ought other than a hypothetical ought?
I don't believe that it's coherent. The concept of categorical, I think that's the right word, categorical oughts.
Pretty close. I mean, it depends how you're defining categorical ought. I use my own terminology just because it's precise and ambiguous. Not everybody uses categoricity the exact same way.
So I want to use your language just to be clear. What word would you use to be a contrary to a hypothetical ought?
Well, what I distinguish between two different, like descriptive ought is any type of ought, either a hypothetical ought or any other type of ought that is purely descriptive in nature. And a prescriptive ought is a type of ought that prescribes in a way that is not purely descriptive.
Okay. So yeah, so to now that we're on this, we're using the terms the same way. I don't think it is coherent. I don't get any information from you when you tell me that something is a prescriptive ought. I don't think it makes any more sense than saying that is or why is car. It's just words strung together that seems to make sense, and intuitively it seems to make sense. But when you really get into it, there's just nothing there.
All right, I'm curious why. Okay, it seems to make sense. It seems to make a truth claim, but it does not make a truth claim. Why should anyone believe that? Because it seems to make a truth claim to me. Why believe otherwise?
Okay, you have to demonstrate that it's a coherent claim, or else I can just reject it and like you can say, oh, that's just your failure of understanding, and then I can't really, reject that.
I guess, but I mean, I could easily just say atheism is not a coherent claim.
You could. I mean, you could, and then we can get.
All right. Well, I guess we're gonna have an impasse there if you can't justify your claim. Well, it just seems true to you that it's meaningless.
Can you describe it to me in such a way that it makes more sense than it just being, at best, a tautology?
All definitions are tautologies. Ultimately, we can only explain words in terms of other words.
Sure.
Or we can also, I suppose, we can use ostensive definition, just point to examples and hope for the best. That seems to hold for most people, but some people apparently. I guess maybe we're at an impasse here because I don't know how to describe it other than what I did. I could say, well, Here's an example. Some people think there's something wrong with torturing infants. It's like, that's meaningless to me. It's like,
Well,
right, how about, I
so
don't know what else you can do, but you at least agree that, okay, if not false, at least it is not true. It is not the case that makes a truth that claim that is true, right?
sorry.
Okay, if God does not exist, it is not the case that the following is a truth apt claim that is true. Some things are prescriptively you shouldn't do. You agree with that, right?
I'm having trouble following it, to be honest.
Okay, so a truth apt statement is a statement that is either true or false.
Sure.
So a truth apt claim that is true is true. Now, a way for something to be not a truth apt claim that is true is something that's just meaningless. It's neither true nor false. Hence, we can agree that on atheism, it is probably the case that the following is not a truth apt claim that is true. Stuff is morally wrong. Some things are morally wrong.
So again, I'd say, given anything, given anything, if you accept the prescriptive usage of the word morality, something being morally wrong is incoherent to me.
So, given anything, that would include given atheism, right?
And theism, yes. So,
all right. Well, at least given atheism, that following is not a truth apt claim. I wouldn't say given anything because some varieties of theism entail that morality exists.
So, can you or can you not, at least right now, demonstrate that saying you shouldn't do X with no context or no appeal to any type of standard has any information within that claim?
Well, because I can use words, but any words I use, you just say they're not coherent. So, for example, I could define prescriptively, well, what does ought mean? Well, it prescribes in a way that is not, it prescribes in a way that's not descriptive. You could say, well, that's not coherent. Okay, well, I could just look up terms in dictionary. It's like, okay, something that obligates, that denotes obligation. And you could say, well, that's not coherent either. And we can go, I can look up words down the dictionary, you just say not coherent, not coherent, not coherent.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I don't think that would be very successful in communication.
I think given those examples, yeah, because those just seem to be fairly synonymous, or at least reflecting the same idea.
As is the nature of definitions.
But in the end, all you're saying is, to me, why is car? And then, I could use different words, like why is automobile and why is civic? Like I'm getting nothing more than just you shouldn't. Shouldn't with regards to what? No, just shouldn't. In which case, who cares? But that's kind of another topic, or that's another aspect of this discussion. So, okay, so you at this point, we can move on from there, where you can't actually demonstrate, at least that oughtness without a standard makes any sense.
I guess I don't know what you mean oughtness without a standard. You mean something other than a prescriptive ought doesn't make sense to you.
Prescriptive ought doesn't make sense. You would need it to be descriptive for it to make any sense.
Okay. So when I went down to worldviews before, I think this sort of illustrates why some people are theists and why some people are atheists, at least partly, because you and I both agree that given atheism, it is not a true statement that some things are morally wrong. Whereas to me, it doesn't seem reasonable to me to deny that there's something morally wrong with torturing infants. Not only is that meaningful, I mean, I can understand it. It seems coherent to me. I don't seem to have any reason why to believe it's not coherent. It also just seems true to me. I was like, well, clearly there's something wrong with torturing infants. And as I said, I think this is what this discussion is used to help illustrate.
So for me, there's a lot of information when somebody says it's morally wrong to harm infants. And I don't need to appeal to nothing like you are. I actually appeal to a standard. I am appealing to something to which I can compare that action, and then I can make my my judgment. Right. So when somebody says it is wrong to kill infants, what I know that sentence to mean is the unnecessary harm of children's well-being is something that we should avoid, because we value well-being. So if I were to go to a Nazi, and I were to say it is wrong to kill Jews, and they would say why, and I would say because Jews are valuable, and they just disagreed, then they would just they wouldn't agree with me, and we'd be at an impasse. And if you're there saying no, you just shouldn't, I don't see how that has any more or less weight. But being able to convince people is kind of, again, another story. I don't see how you appealing to nothing, which is what prescriptive oughts are, describes our usage of the word morality any better than me appealing to something like well-being or freedom.
I don't know what you mean by appeal to nothing. I mean, I could say this is what prescriptive ought means, and you could say it's incoherent, but that wouldn't be the same thing as appealing to nothing. Majority population seems to understand what I mean when I say, we shouldn't do certain things. So what do you mean by appealing to nothing?
So appealing to something is essentially answering the question why. Would you agree with that?
Okay, so you mean like, do I have an explanation for why it's wrong to torture infants?
Well, you're saying it's wrong because it's morally wrong. Like, it's just a tautology. It's wrong because that's what wrong means, right?
Well, not exactly. What wrong means, I can simply define what I mean by morally wrong is that an action is morally wrong for someone only if they ought not to do it.
Yeah,
if you're asking me why it's morally wrong to torture infants, I could appeal to something like, well, you're causing unnecessary suffering, much like you can. The main difference between you and I, though, is that I have an additional stipulation which says we prescriptively ought not to decrease well-being in that way. That's something we shouldn't do. Whereas your view would not allow that. Your view would just, we have an agreed upon goal. Well, ought we to achieve that goal? And you'd say, no, it's just something that we believe to do. It's just something that we want.
So when you say we prescriptively have this ought, I don't see how that's appealing to anything. You're just saying we should. Hey, why shouldn't we kill babies? We shouldn't. Why though?
Well, no, because it harms well-being, just like you.
But why should, according to your worldview, where we're not appealing only to something that we subjectively agree upon, like freedom or well-being, according to you, why should we? Like, it's not even really the is ought problem.
No, we can agree that it harms well-being and that we shouldn't do that. So as far as values go, you and I can have actually very similar values when it comes to well-being. The primary difference between your meta-ethical view and mine is that in addition to these values, there's also that additional dimension that we ought to value those things.
So
that would not exist on yours.
So my question is why?
Why ought we value those things?
Yeah.
So that opens up a new can of worms that kind of goes outside the scope of this debate. So on your worldview, I imagine that there is no why. That's just something that we agree on. We can have an infinite rest of things. So if I were an atheist moral realist, I would say that this oughtness for valuing stuff is just more or less a brute fact. As a theist, I could say that we are made in the image of God. God commands us to value each other in that way, and because we are made in this image, and so on and so forth. That goes well outside the topic of the debate.
So I feel like that is in fact the topic of the debate, because unless you provide an answer to that question, then I'm here left with you appealing to nothing with regard to why we should do anything. You're just saying we should, and then when I say but why, then you're saying, oh, that doesn't matter. In which case we're kind of in the same place, and God hasn't entered the discussion yet.
Well, the reason why it's outside the topic of debate is, for example, if you can't see anything wrong with torturing infants just for fun, it doesn't even mean anything to you, then at that point, we're at an impasse. And there really isn't anything I can appeal to that to me is more obvious than there being something wrong with torturing infants. So in a way, this is sort of the end of the conversation. We both agree that the first premise is in some sense true, that if God does not exist, then it is not a true statement that there's something wrong with torturing infants, for example.
No. So again, I disagree with that, because
you disagreed with it.
even if God were to exist, there'd still be no answer to the question, why should we do
You
anything?
see, that doesn't matter as long as you agree that given that God does not exist, it is not a truth have true statement. I'll put it this way. Do you know what a material implication is? The material conditional.
Can you explain?
All right. So it's a position in logic. So that theorem I mentioned earlier, where given A, probably C entails probably if A, then C, that comes from a material implication. In propositional logic, a material conditional is if P, then Q just means it is not the case that P is true and Q is false. So in this case, and if A, then C, A is the antecedent, C is the consequent. So the material implication or material conditional says it's not the case that A is true and C is false. It's not the case that the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. That seems like a weak claim, but as it turns out, it's usually good enough for a lot of the rules of logic that most of us are familiar with. Like if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Or if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Modus ponens and modus tollens, respectively. So as long as you agree that the constant that the if you agree that the antecedent is true, and as long as it's not the case that the antecedent true and consequent is false, then the material implication is true. So you believe that if God does not exist, then it is not a truth have true statement that moral wrongness does not exist. You agree actually with the consequent. So as long as you agree with the consequent, the material implication is true. You follow me?
Shit. No, I
Okay.
apologize for the language, James.
All right. It is
Well,
not the
let
case.
me. I
Wait,
feel
quite
like
did.
maybe
As long as the consequent is true. Okay. The material implication is true as long as it is not the case that the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. That's the only way. True antecedent, false consequent. That's the only time it's false. Otherwise, it's true.
Sure.
So what that means is that if the consequent is true, then it is not the case that the antecedent is true and the consequent is false, right?
Right.
So that means that the material implication is true. Because it's not the case the antecedent is true and consequent is false. Consequent is true, then material implication is true. Now, do you
So
follow me?
I'm going to have to blame my inability to visualize this. And I really apologize if you feel like this takes away from your argument. I do not mean to just take this away from you. I can't visually grasp this.
All right, I have an idea to
Okay. So
help with this.
while you're finding that, I'd like to ask this question. Do you feel that my inability to answer the question of why it's actually bad to kill babies in a prescriptive way is reason enough to not hold atheism?
Your inability to explain.
My inability to answer the question, why should we not kill babies in a way that isn't descriptive, is enough of a reason for you to not hold atheism?
Not really, which is why that was never my argument.
So it seems like you just said earlier you're appealing to your intuition, like it's factual that it's wrong to kill babies, and it seems like because I can't account for that in a prescriptive way, then therefore I'm wrong.
No, my whole argument was trying to give a general idea of why, given atheism, it is unlikely that the prescriptive oughtness, that the morality exists.
Okay, so and I feel like because you weren't willing to back up the claim that moral oughtness exists or is even coherent, then your argument at least ended. Or I don't want to say debunked. That's kind of a strong word, but I don't see a way in which what you said is is relevant until you can back up the claim that moral oughtness is at least a coherent concept.
Right. We can agree to disagree on whether it's coherent that there's something wrong with torturing infants. That's probably something we're going to have to agree to disagree on, because sometimes in philosophy, it boils down to two people having differing intuitive perceptions. Like, it seems to me that P is true. Well, it doesn't seem to me that P is true. And that's kind of where, and that's part of the reason why atheists and theists exist. Like what I mentioned in my opening statement, sometimes it boils down to different intuitive perceptions, different conflicting worldviews.
So if you can accept that we can just agree to disagree, I think that's a long way off from showing that morality proves or is evidence for a God's existence.
Well, yeah. So whereas,
sorry to cut you off. It seems like this is just as subjective as many theists, not necessarily including you, would criticize secular people that believe in secular morality would hold. I don't know if that sentence strung together, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying.
all right. So can you see my screen here?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So this thing, maybe if I zoom more. Truth table. All right. So this thing right here, if P, then Q. That's a sort of a simple and symbolic logic.
Sure.
So true, false, false. This is the only time it can be false. Now, imagine if it's true, true. So God does not exist, morality does not exist, or it is a not a truth app true statement that morality exists. So that is the situation in which this material implication is true. You see it now?
What's P and Q there?
Okay, imagine in our case, P is God does not exist.
Uh-huh.
Q, in our case, is it is not a truth app statement that some things are morally wrong.
Is there any way you could phrase that in a different way, in a more
Well, I
limited
did
way?
say if God does not exist, then nothing is morally wrong. That was the simple statement. But your objection was that moral wrongness is not a coherent concept, and so it's neither true nor false. You seem to be adopting a non-cognitivist view.
Somewhat, yeah.
So I had to be a little bit awkward and say it's not a truth app true statement. Because there was like I don't know if there's another philosophical term for it. I mean, those are the philosophical terms I'm familiar with to describe that. Maybe there's another one I'm just not familiar with. But we could just say it's not true in the broad sense. Where untrue just means not a truth app true statement. It is not true that some things are morally wrong.
Okay, so P is if God doesn't exist.
P is God does not exist.
P is God doesn't exist. Q is
it's untrue that some things are morally wrong.
It's untrue that some things are morally wrong. If God does not exist, then it is untrue that things are morally wrong. So if God does not exist, it is untrue that things are. I don't know. I'm having the hardest time grasping this.
Untrue in this case means it's not a truth app true statement.
No, I get it. I get that.
I guess if you're not used to analytic philosophy, maybe these things are a bit difficult.
Yeah, it's like I'm definitely not used to analytic philosophy. I honestly like discussing this in more layman's way. I know this isn't like super complicated stuff, and it could be just because we're in this conversation, or I'm just an idiot. I'm not getting it. I think we can discuss this in ways that aren't done analytically, and if you think that's a disservice,
logic forever, logic and math.
Yeah, so I do truly apologize that I'm in a way not allowing you to tackle this in a way that you're more comfortable.
I blame the K through 12 education system. It is appalling that propositional logic, that basic logic, is not part of K through 12 education system. It boggles my mind. It's logic. Come on, everybody should know it.
No, I hear you. Okay, so I feel like I've been asking a lot of questions. I want to go back to that first question I asked of how would a world without God's existence look any different than our world with regard to how we're treating each other and what we're calling morality. I'd like to ask that again. So if you want to answer that, feel free. If you don't want to answer it and you want to ask your own question, I don't want to bogart the.
All right. So as I mentioned before, my worldview is that although it was not part of my argument, that God grounds morality, and God also is the one who created the universe. So if morality did not exist, then God wouldn't have existed. In which case, God wouldn't have created the universe. In which case, nobody would be around to have any societies whatsoever.
Okay.
So it'd be like, well, how would the world be? How would a society be different if there were no oxygen? Well, we'd all be dead. We wouldn't have a society.
Well, okay. So let's say God didn't exist, right? and there's some unknown explanation for why the universe exists as a whole. Let's just
So,
say
like a non-theistic morality, that moral properties exist as brute facts, but there's no creator.
No. I'm still not talking about prescriptive morality.
Oh, okay.
Let's say there were animals, humans that had well-being and could feel things, and one of them said, you know what, I want to have maximal well-being. I don't want to live in fear. I want to be able to gain resources, et cetera, et cetera. He finds someone else that's like, oh, I'm going to kill you for your resources. He's like, no, I'm going to stay away from you. Hey, do you think we can get together and improve our situation together? That person says, yeah, let's do it. They get together, and then they get more and more people who agree. And there are always these people on the outside that are like, hey, we want in. We want to take your resources and not be part of this social contract. And then this grows and grows and grows. And over time, you have societies that all have similar morals, and they all participate in this social contract. And you always have other people that disagree. So in no way in this scenario did God come into the picture. And I think this scenario accurately describes the reality we are in right now. So your response of, if God didn't exist, then nothing would exist, I don't think answers my question.
So, right then, repeat your question. What is it? Maybe I didn't understand it the first time correctly.
In a world where God didn't exist, but let's say reality could still exist, or even better, in a world where God just has nothing to do with morality, it has nothing to do with how we treat each other. Let's say it's a deistic God, or it's a Christian God, but he's blind and deaf, and he can't say, his mind, his lights went out, he's gone. In a world where this is the case, how would what I'm describing to be how people treat each other be any different? Like, what phenomenon are we seeing in the world that is necessarily indicative of a God existing? And if a God didn't exist, how would that phenomenon change or not be there?
Okay, how would a world in which God existed and morality existed be different from what exactly?
No. How would a world in which God, whether he existed or didn't, had nothing to do with morality, look any different than the world we have right now?
In which God had nothing to do with morality? So, okay, so we're comparing two worlds. This world is the real world. And the other world, your scenario, is where God created the universe, but he didn't have anything to do with anything to do with morality.
Or God doesn't exist.
Or God is, well, yeah. Well, in the world in which God didn't exist, I would think that the world wouldn't exist at all because God created the universe. But maybe what you're really thinking of is, imagine a world like ours, but God did not create the universe. It just always was.
Sure.
And but we still have the same moral beliefs we do. Everything else is the same, except that God in reality doesn't exist. But otherwise, the world is maximally similar to ours. Is that right?
Sure.
Okay. Well, then we wouldn't be able to tell any empirical difference between those two worlds, not as far as I can tell, anyway.
Okay. So, given that we are in at least one of those worlds, how can any phenomenon we see about how humans treat each other, i.e., morality, serve as evidence for God?
Well, how do I know you exist?
What do you mean? Like
All
me
right.
as a thinking agent, or?
Well, yeah, just as any other person. For example, imagine what sense experience wise would there be different between where I exist, but this world, the world as it is right now, as opposed to another world where I'm a brain in a vat of chemicals hooked up to electrodes and so forth.
You could not.
And yeah, exactly, I couldn't. And so, what is the solution to this problem? Well, uh, in a way, there is no solution. In a way, there is. So the reason I believe that you exist is largely due to my sense experience. Now, could my sense experiences be wrong? Yeah, they could be. We could conceive of brain to vat scenarios, but in the absence of some reason to believe that my experiences are false, it seems I'm rational to trust them in the absence of any good reason to believe otherwise. And so there's one philosophical view called phenomenal conservatism, which very, very roughly just says we're rational and believing what seems to be true to us. We have at least some justification in believing what seems to be true for us, and the absence of anything that would undercut that justification, and the absence of anything that would undercut it.
Sure.
So, yeah, I don't know for certain that you are with me, that I'm speaking to you right now. Maybe I'm a brain in a vat, but in the absence of any reason to believe otherwise, I'm rational to trust what my experience tells me. That same principle holds true with moral experience. Is it conceivable that, moral wrongness doesn't exist? Yeah, it's conceivable. It's also conceivable that the external world isn't real. But in the absence of any reason to believe otherwise, I have no more reason to doubt my moral experience than I do to doubt my intuition that the external world is real. It's not perfect, but it's really all we have to go on.
See, I feel like the I feel like that works against you. So, with regard to me being a philosophical zombie or you being a brain in a vat, you're assuming that the world we experience, the physical world, doesn't need any extra metaphysical grounding.
I'm not assuming that, actually.
Okay, so when you
You may
say,
assume that, but I don't.
well, when you say, is it? Am I correct in saying you assume you're not a brain in a vat, even though you cannot prove otherwise?
I do assume that I'm not a brain in a vat, yes.
Okay, so you're rejecting an underlying metaphysical principle to support your reality.
What
right?
underlying metaphysical principle?
Let's say the simulation that your brain is receiving, or these thoughts that your brain is receiving. Like the world we experience is the top level, and then anything underneath explaining that, being some quantum physics construct, you being a brain in a vat, everyone else being philosophical zombies, all those would be underlying it and supporting it. And unless we have evidence of those things, we can reject them, even though any of them could be just as true as anything else, right?
I think it might be just because it's gone deep into philosophy, if we're able to just give a big picture view in terms of like connecting the dots for myself and for the audience in terms of.
So sorry about that.
That's all right.
Okay, so what I'm saying is, you are accepting that the world that we are fed by our senses is true, and that you're rejecting underlying metaphysical constructs like you being in a brain in a vat. I think to do the same with regard to morality, we can just see the world around us, see that people treat each other certain ways because that's what they want, and reject any underlying metaphysical principle like prescriptive moral ontology.
Well, that depends on whether it is reasonable to not accept that there's something morally wrong with torturing infants just for fun. In my opinion, it does not seem reasonable, but I understand this is one of those your mileage may vary sort of things.
That just seems like an appeal to consequence, where you're saying it because I don't want it to be unreasonable.
No, that's not anything like that. It's not that I don't want it to be reasonable. It's that it does not seem reasonable to me. Like, think of it this way. Suppose we're looking at data for whether climate change is happening right now, whether anthropogenic climate change is real. I say, well, it seems reasonable to me that this data implies that climate change is real. It's not reasonable to think that anthropogenic climate change is not real. Now, when I say it reasonable, I'm not appealing to consequence like, oh, I don't like it. I'm saying this is what seems reasonable to me.
Okay, so I think using prescriptive morality, it isn't reasonable, and you're saying it can't not be reasonable because it seems reasonable. Therefore,
well, I'm just pointing out that you and I have different intuitive perceptions on this particular issue. As I explained in my opening statement.
I hope so. This may be consistent with what you said, but it may not be. I intuitively know that certain things are wrong with regard to human well-being and freedom, and so much so that intuitive feeling has grown outside of the scope of humanity and also applies to animals. Like when I see a dog being kicked, even though I think morality is only about human well-being, I intuitively feel that a dog being kicked is immoral. So I'm not saying that I don't have these same intuitions. I just think these intuitions don't reflect anything about prescriptive morality. They just reflect that we feel certain things about, well-being and freedom. And this is due to a number of different reasons. It's partly evolution, it's partly society, partly reason and logic.
Well, I don't. It almost seems like we would have to have the same different intuitions, because to you don't even see it as a coherent concept. You can't even understand prescriptive oughtness as anything meaningful.
Okay, so
So we'd have to have different intuitive perceptions, right?
no, so I think we have the same intuition. So like if I see somebody being murdered, I intuitively know that that's wrong, and I can, think back, okay, why is my intuition telling me this, and I appeal to how that thing hurts human well-being or freedom. When you do the same, instead of you appealing to human well-being or freedom, you may do that, but you go back another step and say it's also because moral or prescriptive morality is true or exists.
Well, no, when you say you intuitively know that it's wrong, you don't mean wrong in the sense that I mean it. Because so you don't intuitively know that it's wrong in the sense that I do.
Yeah.
But that would mean then that you and I have different intuitions, because ever since I grew up as a child and my parents taught me on their knee saying, okay, certain things are right and wrong. How did I understand what they meant? Well, I assumed that they talked about prescriptive oughtness when it came to deontic moral facts. Now, I was not an analytic philosopher by this point, so I didn't have the terminology used to describe it in the way that I just described it to you. But that's how I understood them to mean. And it just seemed true to me growing up that there are certain things that people prescriptively ought not to do. This was immediate to my consciousness. Now, if you don't have that perception, then it would mean that you and I have different intuitive perceptions with respect to this particular issue.
Well, it's sorry, did I cut you off?
Now, go ahead.
I feel like it's like, I don't know, it'd be like looking at a red ball, and we both intuitively, I don't know if that's a good example. I'll just keep going with it. But we both see a red ball. We intuitively know that it's red. And you're saying the thing that you're intuiting is that it's painted with I don't know, some type of gouache. I don't know. It's painted with a specific thing, and you're not actually providing evidence. So like we're both experiencing the same phenomenon and the feelings associated with that phenomenon, and you're appealing to something that doesn't make sense to me. And I think it doesn't make sense. I think you're against the idea that it doesn't make sense, so much so that it has to make sense. Like atheism has to be false, because for you to accept that it doesn't make sense for it to just be true or just be immoral or moral or whatever, would be, it would be something you couldn't handle. And I'm not saying personally or something.
No, not really, because originally you may not be aware of this, but originally I did not find the moral argument to be a convincing argument. There was a point in my life where something just seemed to be wrong to me, regardless of whether God existed. The connection between God and morality was not apparent to me. It was more obvious that some things were morally wrong than whether God exists. And that's how, believe it or not, some atheists are like that too. A lot of atheists have that intuition that some things are morally wrong. Do most of them have that intuition? It's hard to say, but a lot of them do. And if we can go back to, I'd like to try one more time here for this thing. So just try to focus it on one at a time.
Sure.
Okay, so God does not exist. You agree with that part, right?
No.
You don't agree that God does not exist?
I'm a non-theist, or a agnostic, some people call him. I don't see reason to believe that God doesn't exist.
Okay, so you don't know whether it's true or false whether God exists. That's your position?
Sure.
Okay. How about now let's focus on this. It is untrue, by which I mean it is not a true truth-apt statement that some things are morally wrong. Is that statement correct? It is not true that some things are morally wrong.
Yes, if included in that statement is the idea that things being morally wrong prescriptively isn't coherent. And I think
okay. Yeah. So notice that this mean is true right here. And if that's true, then this material implication is true. In fact, anytime the consequent is true, the material implication is true. The material conditional is true. Do you see that in this truth table here?
Sure. I do want to say in advance, I don't think P therefore Q.
Well, you do in the sense of material implication, because this is the only way right here that a material implication can be false.
Well, so I think that P could be God does exist, and T would sorry Q. Yeah. I think P could be God does exist, and Q could remain the same.
That's your prerogative, but as long as you believe this consequent is true, you're committed to believing that material implication is true because of this truth table.
Well,
You see that?
I don't see that it's a consequent.
Okay, so in logic, P is called the antecedent and Q is called the consequent. That's just the name for those two parts of a conditional statement.
Does Q necessarily need to follow from P for this to
No, for material implication, they don't have to be related to each other at all.
Okay, so they're at this point unrelated.
Yeah, they don't need to be for material and conditional. So that has allowed some people to believe that, okay, that doesn't quite capture the normal English sense of if P then Q. But for purposes of my argument, that doesn't even matter. As long as the premises are true, the conclusion follows necessarily. And if you believe that the first premise is true, the second premise is false, and that's just where I disagreement would lie. But if you agree the consequent is true, then you're committed to believing that the first premise is true.
If your conclusion is P therefore Q, I don't think that follows from P and Q.
That's not the conclusion. That's a premise.
Okay, got it.
Premise is
P
that
therefore Q is your premise. I don't think that's
well, if P then Q is the statement. And in this case, it's most charitably understood as a material conditional.
If P then Q is your premise.
Yes, and it's most charitably understood as a material conditional.
Okay, so that's how I disagree with that premise.
Well, you agree with the consequent though, right? You agree with Q?
I agree with Q.
Okay, but now notice this truth table here.
Mm-hmm.
So here is one possibility. Well, then the material implication is true, right? If P is true and Q is true, then the material implication is true, right?
So I see the table, right? So I think P is false, and actually,
all right. Well, if P is false and Q is true, then the material conditional is true.
There's got to be something I'm missing, because I have no idea how you're getting P therefore Q from P and Q. Like the order could be changed, and it would be the same.
Well, I suppose you could change the order if you wanted to.
Yeah, and if you change the order, then you get the second one, which you get false.
The second one?
If you
this one?
if you change the statements, if P is it is untrue that some things are morally wrong, and Q is God does not exist, or yeah.
That's true. If the premise were something different, the premise could be false, but the premise as it is true, as long as the consequent is true.
So because you can just all I see is two unrelated premises, and then
propositions.
Propositions. Thank you. Because all I see is two unrelated propositions, and then you're attaching the letters P and Q to them respectively, and therefore getting P therefore Q. Like you can get this. You can do the same thing vice versa, and either get false or you can get Q therefore P. Like I'm not seeing how these are connected. Like,
all right. Try to approach this logically and analytically, breaking down components. Now, in this case, P, the antecedent, is God does not exist. Q is it is untrue that some things are morally wrong. The only way it can be false is if P is true and Q is false. So as long as Q is true, then this material implication is true. Is that right?
According to that chart, yes.
Yes.
But I believe that either I'm misunderstanding something completely, or that you aren't accurate in your description of how this chart works. I think we can go on a while about this, and it may be better to
all right, I would get some like a book on propositional logic, but this is what a material implication is. P is true and Q is false is the only way a material conditional can be false. But that was
I totally understand your argument, and And if there's something I'm missing, then I will, and you're accurate in your conclusion, then I will accept it. But for now, I intuitively know that you are describing that chart in such a way that it's making your conclusion true without it actually.
Well, it's just something that helps explain why while you and I both agree that the first premise is in some sense true. So I believe that we both agree that given atheism, moral wrongness probably isn't as real. Whereas if God exists, at least the God of my theology exists, it would imply that some things are morally wrong. Now you might think that the God of my theology is meaningless and incoherent, but that would be a different matter.
I wouldn't say the God of your theology is incoherent.
You probably would, because it entails the existence of morality, and you don't believe that morality is a coherent concept. At least not the sort of morality I was talking about.
I guess if you support the claim that your God existing means that your description of morality is true or accurate, then yeah, I'd have to conclude that your God is incoherent.
I think at this point it might be good to move into the Q&A. I hate to jump in because
no, that's okay. We're pretty much an impasse. We both just have different intuitive perceptions about whether morality exists, basically. Anyway.
So I appreciate both of you guys. This has been really interesting, and it's been a little bit more rigorous, which is awesome. You know, getting into some of the logical proofs. So with that, we will jump into the Q&A. I forgot to mention, everybody, if you have a question, if you just put @moderndaydebate in the live chat, and then let us know who your question is for, I'd be thrilled to ask whoever speaker you want to ask a question to. And I always forget, super chats, they automatically are put to the top of the list no matter what time during the debate, and you can also make a comment towards one of the debaters during the question and answer. So with that, we are thrilled to start these questions. And first up, Tom34B, good to see you. Thanks so much for your question. He asks, question to Theist Wade. Do you know what emergence is, and how could it affect your point of view on how atheists justify morality?
I do not know what he means by emergence in this context.
Gotcha.
Emergence can mean like any number of different things.
I mean, my guess is maybe emergence, like an emergent property, but I think he's maybe referring. It was really.
Yeah, I know what emergent property is, but I don't know what it means in this context.
Yeah.
I normally see it in like terms like philosophy of mind. I don't normally see it. I would know what he means by this.
My guess is he's referring to. This is just, I'm shooting in the dark. That it might be because it was really early. He might be referring to moral. Moral
non-naturalism. So he might be saying that emergentism in the sense of non-natural properties just emerge from natural properties. I mean, that's what I can guess he means. I'm not really sure.
That's my guess.
Well, it wouldn't affect it much. So if I were, well, again, he hasn't explained himself here, so I'm just going to have to shoot in the dark. So if I were an atheist moral realist, I would believe that non-natural properties just emerge out of natural properties. And what would my response to an atheist be that? Well, it'd be very much the same case. I would point out that on atheism, we'd have the same intuitions of morality existing, regardless of whether morality exists. And so on atheism, we don't have any good reason to believe that this emergence happens. And then I could point out all the same things I did before, explaining why it is on atheism, it is unlikely that these non-natural properties exist. And if that's true, then the first premise of my argument is true. And then, yeah, we're off to the races.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And if I, for those of Tom, if I butchered your question, if you meant something else by emergence, forgive me. I'm just shooting in the dark. Darth Calculus, thanks for your question. He asked, question for Maverick, is moral nihilism incoherent, in parentheses, definitely false, or is it just unlikely to be true? Your evidence seems to be that it was contrary to your intuition.
Right, so I don't think moral nihilism is incoherent. There's nothing self-contradictory about it. My view on it would be very similar to like brain in the vat theory. Like, is it incoherent that we're brains in vat? Well, no. Same thing with moral nihilism. But just as we are rationally justified in accepting what our experience tells us with respect to the external world, we're also rationally justified in believing that our moral experience is vertical, that there is something wrong with torturing infants in the absence of any good reason to believe otherwise.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Then, Darth Calculus again. Question for Candor. For the moral statement, quote unquote, you ought to do X if you value Y, is it coherent to have a Y with objective value?
I think objective value, I think value is things that value is something that we give to things. I don't think objective value makes sense.
Gotcha.
I'll answer the question.
Next up, we appreciate it. And Skyout asks, ask Candor, if he woke up tomorrow and there was no police, would he go out and hurt someone? If not, why? What's the consequence?
Yeah, I feel like we kind of covered that in our last discussion. No, I wouldn't hurt people. I think for the most part, I would have the same consequences as hurting people, or as I do now. For if I hurt people, people would hold me accountable, and I would risk my own well-being. I also think if for some reason there were no rules, society would struggle a lot, but people like me would get together with each other and kind of recreate the same society as best we could.
Yeah, and as I mentioned in my opening statement, as a disclaimer, moral nihilists can be decent people. Just because you don't accept the idea that there's stuff that's morally wrong, you can behave very much the same way as if you do believe it.
Can I add one additional comment?
Sure.
I'm not a decent person, so you're wrong about that.
I'm guessing you haven't killed anybody, right?
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And Tyler Durden asks, question for the Theist. His name's on the border. So he says, if you know a rape is occurring and have the ability to prevent it, what is the moral thing to do?
Well, I suppose if I saw a rape happening and I had the ability to prevent it, I would probably have an obligation to stop it if I could. Ceteris paribus, of course, assuming that there's no morally sufficient reason for me to not stop it from happening.
You got it. Thanks so much. And thanks for your super chat, Stefan. We totally appreciate it. It says UCF just went up by 2 with 4 minutes to go. So, good news for any UCF fans. And thanks a lot, Stefan Steen. And next up, Tyler Durden asks, follow-up, does God do the moral thing when he knows a rape is occurring? He has the power to prevent it, after all.
That's a question for me.
Yep.
That would depend on whether he has a morally sufficient reason to not prevent it from happening. So, as a theist, I believe he does. And the argument from evil, though, is a whole nother box of worms. But I can give a sort of rough idea of why I don't think this is a good objection on atheism. So, on atheism, as for reasons I sort of explained in this debate, there would be no such thing as objective morality if atheism is true. And the argument from evil has to have objective morality for the argument to work at all. Because think of it this way. Suppose a theist says has this following standard of goodness. It is good for humans to try to overcome the evil in the world with the limited abilities it has without God interfering. And so if God adopted this standard of goodness, God will allow all the evil that exists in this world. Now, an atheist might say, well, if God adopted my standard of goodness, he would not allow this evil that exists. Without an objective moral standard, there's no objective fact of the matter about which standard of goodness God would adopt if he existed, in which case there's no objective fact of the matter whether God would allow evil if he existed, in which case the argument from evil just collapses under its own weight. Without objective morality, the argument from evil can't even get off the ground.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Skyout, your old buddy Candor, man, your old nemesis. He is here lurking. So he asks Candor, how does he ground morality, and is that absolute?
So that's kind of our entire discussion last time. I'm not really certain what ground means. I think
I have some idea.
It's used pretty silly. Yeah, if you want to explain, maybe you can.
All right. Well, so we say that, for example, moral properties, is that they exist, they're non-natural. But then there's a question, okay, well, so how do they exist exactly if they're non-natural? Is Platonism true? They exist as abstract objects. Do they exist in God in some way? Like, for example, one could believe that moral wrongness is one of the same properties that which God forbids. So given these moral properties exist, how do they exist exactly? And your answer presumably is that, well, they don't exist. They're not even coherent.
Morality, the way I use the word is, so the way I'd answer this question, the way I've tried to in the past, is I would substitute the word define for ground. To me, they mean the same thing, at least in this context. When somebody would say, how do you ground morality? I would say, well, morality are those, the way I use the word at least, is morality are those actions that, or it's a system of evaluation where those actions that are beneficial to human freedom are called moral, and those that are contrary to human freedom are called immoral. So if you want to say that, oh, you're just defining it like that and that doesn't count, I would just say, no, that's what I'm grounding my morals in. So, and I'd love to talk to you, Maverick, more about this. We can do it later. This was Sky Out's question, so.
Next up, we have Tyler Durden asks, question for Mav. Why do mirror neurons, neurochemically driven empathy, intrapersonal human bonding, and societally subjective ethical systems influence morals if they are rooted in facts?
Well, just because morality exists doesn't imply that our brains can't influence our own perceptions. I'm an interactive substance dualist, so of course I believe that brains influence our feelings and perceptions. So it doesn't really have anything to do with whether moral facts exist. I mean, I would believe that our brains influence our perceptions and feelings even if I were an atheist.
You got it. Thanks so much. And next up, Tyler Durden also asked, question for Mav. Oh, copy and pasted it twice. That's embarrassing. Nick J asked, question for Maverick. Are not our intuitions fallible? If so, then why is it a good measure for morality? And by extension, how does it provide good evidence for God?
Well, it certainly is true that our intuitions are fallible. Does that mean intuitions are never reliable? Well, clearly not. I mean, well, first we have to define what we mean by intuition. Intuition, in the philosophical sense, refers to what the consciousness immediately apprehends, what is directly present to one's consciousness. So that would include mathematical intuition. Like when we follow along a mathematical proof, we use mathematical intuition. We use rational intuition. We use intuition in that broad sense to determine that the external world is real. And so clearly intuition is sometimes reliable. Otherwise, we could never do mathematics. And so we would never do science if we just rejected anything that relied on intuition. And as far as, so how do we judge intuition? Well, it's basically a case-on-case basis. So rational intuition, that seems to work with mathematics. 2 + 2 = 4, 1 + 1 = 2. The external world seems real. And there does seem to be something wrong with torturing infants.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, Karag Nightwolf. Good to see ya. If morality can only come from a god, does that not spoil it? Does that then mean that we aren't really moral? We were just made to be moral.
No.
I agree.
Gotcha. Karag Nightwolf. Again, isn't morality justified if we are actually choosing to pursue morality to be moral rather than it being an inevitability?
Justified if we're choosing to be moral. I guess I don't know what he means by justified.
Yeah.
I'd have to know what he means by that.
I'm not sure. This is one that I'm totally unsure. So I have no guess. Epic Christ, thanks for your question. He said, "Hi, who challenged who here?" It's a good question. Who?
We both were having a conversation on one of my discussions, and I cordially invited him to a discussion, and he seemed interested.
That's cool. I like it.
I have to go back because I remember something. I thought I remember vaguely saying something like, if some person, I think he asked somebody else for a challenge, and I said, if he's not going to do it, I will do it. I have to go back to be sure if that's what my memory says.
Okay.
Next up, we got that one. Capturing Christianity. He asks, question for Candor. What are your thoughts on the argument from moral knowledge?
I'd have to hear it presented.
So an example of an argument from moral knowledge would be if God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist. We don't know anything. We do know some moral things, like we know it's wrong to torture infants, and therefore God exists. That would be an example of an argument from moral knowledge.
Seems like kind of the same discussion.
Yeah, it's pretty similar. I mean, you don't believe that morality exists, at least not in the sense that I've used it. You don't even think it's a coherent concept. So you wouldn't believe
Yeah.
that moral knowledge exists in the sense of morality that we're talking about here.
Yeah, sounds about right.
You got it. Thanks so much. Next up, thanks for that question, by the way, Capturing Christianity. There's a live debate, by the way. I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's April 11th, and it's going to be at Capturing Christianity. So that's going to be on the Resurrection, Matt Dillahunty, Mike Winger. So highly encourage you. Want you to know about debates no matter what channel they're on. So want to quick plug that. And next up, Scott Williamson. To Maverick Christian, how do you know that God is moral since you don't know the mind of that God?
Ooh, that opens up a can of worms a little bit. So basically, well, I kind of like, how do I know that God exists in the first place? And the moral argument is that one sort of argument for God's existence. And well, think about so I didn't go into this in my debate very much, but think about what objective morality is, where objective morality is the idea that there are moral truths that hold independently of our perception of it. Now, just think about what objective morality is, if it exists at all. It's this invisible, non-physical, non-natural component reality transcending in our opinion that says people shouldn't do certain things and we all ought to obey its dictates. Well, that sounds a lot like God, doesn't it? And so my view of theology is that, well, that's just what God is. God, being objective morality incarnate, is just a very straightforward and I think most likely explanation for how objective morality exists. And if that explanation is correct, then God basically just is objective morality incarnate, in which case it would follow inescapably that God is good.
And I'd like to add, if I can, I think this highlights the incoherency of objective morality and the way he's using it. If God is, if objective morality is what you ought to do, then God is what you ought do incarnate. And that's
not quite. I think you might have misunderstood what I meant there. So when I say God is objective morality incarnate, so I'm a quasi divine command theorist, and that what we morally should do is what we morally obligated to do is what God commands us to do. What we shouldn't do is what God forbids us to do.
I wish we had more time because I'd love to keep talking about that, but okay.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next question, Brain Gel asks, if God exists, do you mean, quote unquote, X is wrong, or, quote unquote, X is wrong with respect to God? I think that's for Maverick. I'm not sure.
No, when I say something is morally wrong, very roughly, I just mean that people prescriptively ought not to do it. And that prescriptive ought, as I mentioned in my opening statement, is where prescriptive ought is that type of ought that prescribes without being purely descriptive. So this definition by itself doesn't say whether or not God exists even.
So am I clear in saying that God existing doesn't give us a standard to which we can compare our actions? Rather, he just simply is the reason why prescriptive oughts exist in the first place.
Well, the reason why prescriptive oughts exists on my theology is that God imposes moral obligations upon the world. Now, I've left it open about how exactly this works. I don't necessarily mean he thunders from the sky or anything like that.
Yeah,
but
so,
I just think that's where obligations come from.
Sure.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, Tyler Durden. Question for Maverick. What is a morally sufficient reason to allow rape to occur? I think this is branching off two questions he had asked earlier about would you stop a rape from occurring, and why would God not do it?
I have no idea why God would not do it.
Gotcha. Darwin's Greatest Hits asks, question for Maverick, isn't it also true that if God does not exist, then objective values do exist, since the antecedent is false on your view?
Okay, if God does not exist, then objective moral values do exist. Is that true? If you're using that as a material conditional, in which case the antecedent false and the consequent is true, then yeah, that would be a true material conditional.
Gotcha. Next up, Scott Williamson asks, how can you be sure that the God or that God is moral and not a deception? Or I think they might be saying like not a deceiver. Correct me if I'm wrong, Scott.
How do I know that God is not a deceiver?
I think that's the question.
All right. Well, God is sort of by definition good. And in the absence of, I mean, my theology is that God doesn't lie. That's just part of my theology. As for how would you know that? Well, I don't put myself another can of worms. So I did not go into this in my debate. But so some atheists complain that, well, God is so hidden. Why would he make himself so hidden? In perspective, he's not that hidden. A lot of people believe he exists. And some theists reason that the reason why people do believe in God is that God designed their cognitive faculties in such a way that if they're functioning a certain way in certain environments, in certain cases, we just intuitively apprehend God as real. And if that's the case, we can know some things about him, like God being good and God not being a deceiver. And if that such a God exists and he designed the universe and us in that way, then that is how we know.
Gotcha.
But of course, that only works if God exists.
You bet. Thanks so much. Next up, let's see, Tyler Durden. Thanks for your question. Question for Maverick, coming after you again. Can he demonstrate the soundness of the premise, quote unquote, if God does not exist, objective morality does not exist? And then he put in parentheses, however he worded his original premise.
Can I show that the premise is true? Yes. As long as there's no follow-up questions, I can absolutely show that to be true.
Gotcha. So with that, those are all the questions that we've had come in. So it was just right about when we usually end. We usually go about an hour and a half. I feel bad for Candor Man. Candor Man didn't get quite as much action this time for the Q&A. If anybody has a question or two for Candor Man, we can usher them to the front. Otherwise, just want to say thanks for being here. As mentioned, if there's anybody out there who is familiar with podcasts, we are looking for somebody to hire just to put a podcast on for each show, basically. And it wouldn't be, we don't have the big bucks, but basically just something that we would use from Super Chats. So I have no idea how to do it, and I just don't have the cognitive resources to learn it now. I think I could once summer break comes, but right now I'm behind on research and stuff, so there's no way I can do it now. But want to say thank you to the debaters. They have spent their time here. We know that they, like we said, they love debating for its own intrinsic joy, but we nonetheless thank them for doing it here because there are a lot of channels out there. So very much we appreciate you guys being here.
Yeah, it was, again, my pleasure. Maverick, it was really fantastic talking to you. This was really cordial, and I apologize if I was ever frustrating at any point. James, on your point that, you were apologizing for there not being enough questions for me, I just like to think that the fewer questions there are, the more comprehensive I was at explaining myself. So I'm not insulted.
Just got one for you, though. But
one other thing, if anyone wants to have any discussions with me or clear up maybe a way in which I was not understanding Maverick's argument, I've just put my Discord in the chat. And yeah, just join me. I'll be on my mic and we can talk. Maverick, you can join me as well if you'd like.
Gotcha. So we totally appreciate that. And the question just came in from Capturing Christianity. So this question in particular was, what is your, sorry about that, what's your meta-ethical view?
What's my meta-ethical view?
I'll give you a hint. You're a non-cognitivist.
Yeah, I feel like non-cognitivist gets closest, but I have some ideas about how you can call morality objective after accepting my definition, which a lot of people don't agree with, and I'm still kind of hashing out. So
well, you're non-cognitivist with respect to the prescriptive sort of morality.
Yeah, definitely.
Gotcha. And then one more follow-up. Candor, what's the best argument you're aware of for non-cognitivism?
Just ask people to explain what it means for something for an action to be done just for the sake of doing. Well, ask them to explain or answer the question, what does it mean when you say something should be done without any context or standard to compare it to? I've yet to hear anyone actually explain how the non-cognitivist position is false.
Gotcha. Well, with that, we will wrap up. Just to respect the debaters' time, we appreciate both of you guys being here. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for being here. Thank you for your ideas. And yeah, we're just thrilled to have you. One thing we want to mention is, let's see, this week it'll be a little bit more sporadic. So we are hoping to have scattered debates, depending on whether or not. And by the way, in case it seems, we hope it doesn't seem biased. I don't think it would be biased because we have atheist co-mods sometimes. But it's true that standing for truth, sometimes the notorious standing for truth, as some people despise him, he has been willing to come on and moderate, and so he's just been willing to do it for free. And so sometimes if I have like a small group at church or research conference or something, he's been willing to jump in. So just want to let you know that we might have one other guest moderator this week, and I hope you guys make it easy for him. Thank you so much for mods in the chat. You guys are honestly a huge blessing. Like, you definitely make it easier. And one thing we're kind of considering is if you guys are okay with collecting questions for the Q&A, and that way we could kind of basically put that list there for them. So with that, thank you so much. Have a great night. And again, both of the speakers' links are in the description. I just saw somebody say, they were like, I subbed to both channels. So hope you guys know that you got a good, positive response. So thanks for everything, and have a great night, everybody.
Good night.